Hi, I'm Steven, and I'm going to be reading Peter Pan. Chapter 1. Peter Breaks Through. All children, except one, must grow up. The way Wendy knew was this. One day, when she was a very little girl, she picked a flower from the garden to show her mother. Mrs. Darling held the flower over her heart. "Oh, Wendy," she said with a loving smile, "why can't you stay like this forever?" Wendy was just 2 years old, but from that moment on, she knew that she must grow up. Wendy's mother was a lovely lady. Mr. Darling knew that when he married her. He loved her and she loved him. He liked to boast that she also respected him, which she did. At first, the Darlings worried if they could afford children, but before each child was born, Mrs. Darling said, "Of course we can, George. We'll watch every penny." First came Wendy, then John, and Michael was last. The Darlings had a nurse for the children because Mrs. Darling liked everything just so, and Mr. Darling wanted to be just like their neighbors. But since they were poor, the nurse was Nana, a very proper Newfoundland dog they found in Kensington Gardens. Nana was a very good nurse. She learned to be a nurse by watching the other nurses in the park. She made sure the children bathed properly. She knew when a cough was just a cough and nothing serious, and if one of them cried at night, she was up in an instant to see why. That was easy because she lived in the children's room. When the children started school, Nana made sure they got there safely. She walked primly alongside them, butting into anyone who strayed out of line. She made sure John didn't forget his soccer sweater, and if it looked like rain, she carried an umbrella in her mouth. At school, Nana stayed in the basement while the children sat in classrooms upstairs. Nana didn't like Mrs. Darling's friends to make surprise visits to the children's room, but if they came, she quickly dressed Michael in a clean outfit, brushed Wendy's hair, and tried her best to do something with John's hair. She was a very proper nurse, even though Mr. Darling wondered if the neighbors thought it odd to have a dog for a nurse. After all, he had his position in the city to consider. There never was a happier family until the coming of Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling first heard of Peter while tidying up her children's minds when they were asleep. Children don't know mothers do this, but they do. It's a little like tidying up drawers. Every child has a special place called Neverland, filled with strange and wonderful spots that are his or her very own. Every Neverland is different. Some have rivers and reefs and gnomes and princes and caves of every kind. Others, like John's, had a lagoon where he lived on the sand in a boat turned upside down. Michael's also had a lagoon, but he lived in a wigwam, while Wendy's had a house made of leaves. Neverland is filled with wonderful adventures, and at night, just before you go to sleep, it seems very, very real. Mrs. Darling did not know anyone named Peter, but there he was in each child's mind. "Who is Peter?" she asked Wendy. "He's Peter Pan," Wendy replied. At first, Mrs. Darling was puzzled. Then she remembered her own childhood and someone called Peter Pan who was said to live with fairies. People said he comforted children. Mrs. Darling believed in him then. "But he has grown up now," she said to Wendy. "Oh no," Wendy said. "He hasn't grown up at all, and he's just my size." When Mrs. Darling told Mr. Darling about Peter Pan, he laughed and said it was some of Nana's nonsense. "Forget it and it will go away," he said. But it didn't. One morning, Wendy awoke to find tree leaves scattered about the bedroom floor. They weren't there when she and the boys had gone to bed. "Oh, it was just Peter," she said when her mother asked how they got there. "He didn't wipe his feet as he should when he comes in the window." Wendy smiled. "Sometimes he comes in at night and plays his pipes at the foot of my bed," she said. Mrs. Darling was shocked. "Why, you must have been dreaming," she said. But the leaves were real and came from a tree she had never seen before. Wendy had not been dreaming, and the very next night an extraordinary adventure began. It was Nana's night off, so Mrs. Darling tucked the children into bed. She gazed at them tenderly as she sat by the fireplace to sew. The fire was warm, and the room was bathed in soft light. Soon she began to doze. While she slept, she had a dream. In the dream, Neverland came much too near, and a strange boy got out. The boy had torn the curtain that usually covers Neverland, and Wendy and John and Michael were peeking through. Mrs. Darling dreamed the nursery window blew open, and the boy flew into the room. She thought she recognized him. At his side was a tiny bright light, no bigger than a fist. It darted through the room as if it were alive. The strange light awakened Miss Darling. She put her hand to her mouth in surprise, for she knew at once that the boy was Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling cried out at the first sight of the strange boy. At that moment, Nana entered the room, back from her evening out. She too saw the boy, and not knowing what to think, leaped at him with a fierce growl.